So next we move on to the last part of the process, and that is about stating a final conclusion that addresses the original claim. And in my steps of hypothesis testing, that is step 6 there. So if you recall all the way back to setting up the hypothesis statement, I had you do a little bit of an extra step there. So for this question, they have a claim here, and our original claim is more than 48% of adults would erase their personal information online if they could. So that claim is P greater than 58%. So those are pieces that go in there, and other things that we would normally put together here is we'd normally go ahead and list out the opposite case, and the opposite is less than or equal to 58%. And what we want in between these in the null is the equal, because it's always, always, always equal between our parameter and our number in the null hypothesis. The alternate hypothesis, we want the strict inequality, that is the greater than here. And then after we did that, I had asked you to do the R and the S, and then make a note of which one of these things represents the claim. And our claim there is greater than 58%, so it's the alternate. And what the alternate corresponds to is the second part of writing our conclusion. So when we go to write our conclusion, there's 3 parts of it. And the middle part is either going to be reject the claim that or support the claim that. And if we do this with our hypothesis statement, this little bit extra, when we note that it's S here, S stands for support. There's 2 other parts. That last part is to just go ahead and literally copy paste the claim from the question. So the claim was more than 58% of adults would erase all of their personal information online if they could. So we've got the second part of the conclusion written. We've got the third part of the conclusion written. The only part of the conclusion that we don't have written yet is what comes from our decision of whether or not to reject the null hypothesis. And what we're going to see with that is there's really just one word that's missing. We're either going to say we have sufficient evidence, we don't have sufficient evidence. And we have the evidence when we reject the null hypothesis, we don't have the evidence when we fail to reject the null hypothesis. So we still have to go ahead and address that. Now our rule of rejection is reject null hypothesis if p-value less than or equal to 0.05. They gave us the p-value here. And what you'll normally see me write in a lot of what I do is I'll put the p-value, I will line it up directly underneath what I had in the rule of rejection, because I've had people compare numbers from the wrong place values before. I'd hate for you to do everything correct and get a comparison of two numbers wrong, which would change everything for this. So we're going to reject the null hypothesis if the p-value is less than or equal to 0.05, 5%. Our p-value is 0.3257, so that's over 32%. 32% is not less than 5%, so we fail to reject the null hypothesis. And when we fail to reject the null hypothesis, we don't have the evidence. And the way that you'll normally see it written in the book is they'll use insufficient. So let's pick a nice light color here. So when we fail to reject the null hypothesis, that is what's letting us know whether or not we have the evidence there. So we fail to reject the null hypothesis, we have insufficient evidence too. Our claim's represented by the alternate, so we talk about that, about supporting the claim. So we don't have the evidence to support the claim that more than 58% of adults would erase all of their personal information online if they could. When we went through this process, our initial assumption, what we assume to be true here, is we assume that the null hypothesis is true. So we're assuming a true proportion of 58%. And if our sample result is far enough away from that, in this case, since it's a right tail test, far enough above that, if it was significantly higher, then we would go ahead and reject the idea that the true proportion is 58% and go with our alternate that it's more. But our sample result was not compelling enough. It was too likely to happen if the true proportion is 58%. So we don't have enough evidence, we don't have compelling enough evidence to say that the proportion is greater than 58%. This is kind of our not guilty verdict. And just because you find somebody not guilty doesn't mean that they're innocent. So just because we weren't able to reject 58%, that doesn't mean that it has to be 58%. We just don't have enough evidence to say otherwise, which is why we're phrasing it the way that we do. That's why we're saying fail to reject the null hypothesis versus accept it. And that also leads to our phrasing of the conclusion in that fashion. Now, in real life, what do we do with this information? We would proceed as if the true proportion is 58% until some point down the road, we get evidence to the contrary. But hopefully what you can see now is that little bit of extra time in the setup of the hypothesis statement, we now see that we get the payoff for it in forming our conclusion.